Welcome to today's Bureau Veritas webinar. Bureau Veritas is a global leader in testing, inspection, and certification. A few brief announcements before we begin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. The slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. You can submit questions at any time using the chat box on the right side of the screen. The speaker will answer these questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you experience any issues connecting your computer audio, you can click on Event Board to display calling options. Once you have entered the webinar, the AV pod will appear as a small black box on the top right of your viewing screen. It can be relocated by moving your pointer over the box and clicking the dock icon, which appears in the top left of the box. Thank you for participating in today's webinar, and now for our featured speaker.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Safeguarding the Future of the Feed Supply Chain. My name is Kim Knoll. I work for Bureau Veritas, and I'll be hosting the webinar today and introducing you to our presenters. Here is our agenda. Our speakers will provide a brief introduction to FAMI-QS version 6, followed by a discussion on the feed fraud and defense modules. Then we will share data on what are the most common non-conformances from completed FAMI-QS version 6 audits so far. At the end, we'll have a live Q&A session. Okay, so we have two presenters joining us today. First, I would like to introduce Angela Pellegrino. Angela is an independent consultant with 35 years experience in quality control, quality assurance, and various certification schemes. She is involved in risk analysis, risk assessments, feed and food fraud and defense projects for different governments and organizations. She is also a trainer to quality standards for industry, laboratories, and regulators. She has worked as a technical expert for the Food and Agricultural Organization and the International Feed Industry Federation. She participates in the technical expert group for FAMI-QS and is involved in different projects as a technical advisor. And our second presenter is Kris Middleton. Kris is my colleague here at Bureau Veritas, and he is our food program manager for North America. Kris leads our food safety certification team, managing all deliverables to our clients with regards to our safety and quality certification services. Kris is qualified as an auditor for a number of different food and feed safety standards, including FAMI-QS. He participates in a number of different technical working groups and has over 15 years experience conducting audits for the industry. So that is a quick introduction to Angela and Kris. Both are wonderful resources and available for any questions that may arise after our presentation today. And with that, I will turn it over to Angela to begin our discussion.
Oh, thank you, Kim, for the nice introduction of Kris and myself. Thank you very much. And also thank you to Bureau Veritas for inviting us to talk about the new version of the FAMI-QS code. In this slide, I have, this is the homepage of FAMI-QS. I invite everybody to visit our website. There is a lot of information there. All the documents that we are going to talk about today, they are freely available at the website, and is a very important resource for those companies that are interested in FAMI-QS certification. I would like to start saying that differently from other feed safety or food safety schemes, FAMI-QS certification includes and covers not only safety, but also quality aspects of processes and products. So it's a larger system, and we will also be approaching in most of the requirements of the standards, not only the feed safety, but also the quality aspects. To talk a little bit about the organization FAMI-QS, I show you here, very basic organization chart to give you an overview of the FAMI-QS as a scheme owner. Our offices are based in Brussels, in Belgium. FAMI-QS was founded in 2004, and it was a response to the EU regulation environment that made reference to specific industry codes, and the aim was to facilitate the implementation of the law. So the first version of the code was really a response to this environment. And now it has grown a lot and has been spread all over the world. In this organization chart, the parts that we will probably have more contact with is the one that is in the box that is in the light shade of orange. So the people that are really working on the certification management, all the documents of the standards, and the Secretary General. If we look at the map of the globe, we can see the expansion of the FAMI-QS scheme. In the dark orange shaded areas, these are areas or regions where certified companies are based. And the light shade orange, are still areas or regions that we do not have any organization certified. So it's quite global. And it's a standard that has been very much required in the international business. Here, to tell you a little bit why the code was revised and why this new version 6 was published. There were several different motivations that led to this present version. And they are in this little charts here, these 4 charts. First of all, there were new regulatory developments, especially in China and in the United States. We also received feedback from many regulators, because remember that one of the intentions of the code was really to facilitate the implementation of the regulations in some countries in the world. So this was one of the motivations that led to version 6. Also, and it is a quality and safety systems, of course, we also have to look for continuous improvement. And feedback was also received from members and partners. And also we look carefully at the results from our integrity program. So there was opportunity for improvement, there was room for that, and that was done in the new version. The accreditation standards also changed. Can you go back? Yeah, thank you. The accreditation standards also changed. There was a new publication of 17021. And also in the family of 22000, more specifically 22006 part 6, 2002 part 6, sorry, the prerequisite programs for feed were published. And, as an international development, we also had to improve the standard in view of the high-level structure with the publication of ISO 9001 and the new version of 22000. And because many of the certified companies, they do have different systems implemented, and it would facilitate to integrate them with FAMI-QS. This process took us around 3 years. We started moving forward with a draft of the code version 6. This draft was then sent to the FAMI-QS expert group for their inputs. After their comments, it was sent to different regions where we had local working groups. One of them is the United States. And then after the comments were received from these different regions, it was then sent back to the expert group for their further comments, sent to the board of FAMI-QS for their inputs. According to the international protocol, it was submitted to public consultation. After the comments received from public consultation, it was then delivered back to the expert group for their inputs. And then the final version 6 was published, and it was around September 2017. So the standard now in version 6 complies with the high-level structure of ISO, and it has 10 chapters, the same structure of all the standards that are, derived from 9001. Okay, so the standard is now fit for international implementation. It was reorganized in order to meet the high-level structure. The approach is quality, safety, and also fraud and defense. And we are going to look at these two new pillars as we go down the track. And also the text was elaborated a little bit more on the requirements so that we would have more guidance and also to avoid any misinterpretation. One of the features of the code was about the scope adaptation. When we started in 2004, it was mainly focused on the definitions of the EU regulations. The regulation in EU was changed in 2009, so there were some adaptations to the scope because it was not only feed additives and premixtures anymore, but the EU regulation at that time gave a new definition of a term that they called specialty feed ingredients and mixtures. And in 2017, with version 6, we then introduced the expression specialty feed ingredients, and that's how we call the ingredients or the products that are coming out of the processes that are eligible for FAMI-QS certification. And what is a specialty feed ingredient? A specialty feed ingredient is any intentionally added ingredient that is normally consumed as feed by itself, or else it does not provide the animal a complete or daily ration, but it does have a nutritional or may not have a nutritional value, but it affects the characteristics of feed or animals, the performance, enhancing the performance of the animal, for example. So specialty feed ingredients are simply ingredients that are produced by one of the FAMI-QS recognized processes, and we are going to see what these processes are. And these ingredients, they must have a specific functionality. They must be either technological, sensorial, nutritional, or zootechnical. And so this gives us the opportunity, if we look at the next slide, to include more products in the scope that was not possible in the past because it was more or less tied to the European regulation and to the EU feed register. So here's some examples of products that before they were considered feed materials and therefore could not be included in FAMI-QS scope, but now because they do comply with one of the recognized processes, they are eligible to certification. And if we look at the processes that we call them the recognized process, there are basically 6 different processes, and from them, the products that are called the special feed ingredients come from. So they are a chemical process, a bioprocessing process, mining process, an extraction process, mixing, and a formulation process. So if a company is interested in certifying their process according to the FAMI-QS standard, it has to belong to any of these 6 different manufacturing processes. Also, and adding to the scope that should be related to one of the 6 processes, FAMI-QS also defines 2 different activities. So in order to be certified, a company has to be operating under one of these 2 different activities, either being a trader or having a trading activity, or then being involved in a production activity, or else placing products on the market under the name of the producer. And here we have the main documents of the system. So the FAMI-QS Code of Practice, it is a mandatory document and where all the requirements are stated. And the code works together with what we call the process documents. Remember that we had the 6 different processes that are recognized. So each of these 6 processes has a process document. And what is in this process document? Now, simply the document brings mainly the structure for the AJCCP plans that will have to be constructed in the system so that it complies to the certification requirements. Also, and very important, and the first thing that, any company that decides to go for the certification should comply with is manufacturer is operating and the country of the destination where the manufacturer or the producer is sending his products to. So it is the responsibility of the operator or the manufacturer, as we call it, we call the manufacturer and operator, to take care of the compliance to that regulation. So FAMI-QS has no legal authority to check the compliance of the regulation. Of course, the main regulations will be looked at during the certification process, but no legal action can be taken by any certification body or any certification or scheme owner. So here, let's take a look at the code and the different chapters so that we have an overview, especially of the changes in this new version 6. So, first of all, as any of these new standards that, comply or follow the high-level structure, they are risk-based systems, and that happens with FAMI-QS as well. So version 6 is a risk-based system and has this approach. Therefore, we have to understand the context in which the company is inserted and identify all the external and internal risks that can affect the ability of the company to achieve the intended result that was planned for the feed safety and quality management system. Also, in the same direction and according to the high-level structure of this risk-based concept, we have to identify the needs and expectations of the interested parties. They may be external parties as our clients, our customers, the regulatory authorities, any other external party that we have relation with, and also the internal parties, being our internal departments in the company, or maybe any branch in a corporation. So this should be taken into account as well, and it's part, as in ISO, in the same chapter, that is chapter 4. In the next slide, okay, here we have to determine the scope. And why? We have to consider that the previous elements, or else the scope, boundaries of the system, the applicability of it, the market where we are operating, and all the impact that it may have in our processes and requirements that we have to follow in the standard are taken care of. So we do have to document the scope, taking into account the context that was studied before, the needs and expectations of the parties, the sites where the systems will be implemented, and how it will be operating. Here we see, and a quick mention here, I just put the slide to make a comment that, okay, of course, we're going to need a feed safety and quality policy to be stated and to be included in our system, but FAMI-QS is now requiring that in the feed safety and quality policy, we do include the two pillars that are the fraud and defense programs or system that we are going to see afterwards. So our policy will have to state a commitment to really look for possibilities or vulnerabilities for fraud, and how we have the defense plan implemented in the system. Leadership will play a very important part in this new system and has more responsibilities, and not only will be directly involved in the systems providing or giving support to other parties, internal parties, but also giving directions to specific personnel and helping these people to achieve the results that were planned for the system. So here, one thing that you should expect is that the auditor really will talk to the leader or to the management of the company, trying to check their involvement in the system and how the system operates and how they participate in this operation. Okay, so here, this is chapter 6 that requires actions to address the risks and opportunities that were raised when we defined the context and when we defined the need and expectations of the interested parties. So here we have to propose actions to eliminate, mitigate, or accept the risks, and maybe to enhance the opportunities that we raised or that we found and that we reviewed while working on Chapter 4. There was the context of the system. Now going to operation here, and now we are going to production and really to the floor of the plant. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is about good manufacturing practices. And so here, the important message is we are going to have prerequisite programs that are the GMPs. They are going to be associated with the AJCCP plan that we are going to see in Chapter 8. And this is going to help us to control the hazard. One thing very important, the good manufacturing practices or the PRPs, they should be developed and implemented prior to starting the AJCCP plan development, because they are a prerequisite to the AJCCP. So in this Chapter 7, and we are not going to speak here in detail, but approaching each of the different entries in the chapter, but there is much more text in this chapter and a lot more detail in the chapter that I believe, and I'm sure Kris will highlight some of the details here when he talks about the non-conformities. But in this Chapter 7, the GMPs, they were revised to include the requirements and update also the language and have more details that are also brought by ISO TS 22002 Part 6, that are the feed PRPs, and also your Food Safety Modernization Act in order to prevent problems in the manufacturing of the products rather than relying primarily on reacting to them. So here we have the complete list of the practices that are the good manufacturing practices. They are in 16 different entries in the code, and each of them brings specific requirements on how what are the requirements and what are the details or what we have to comply with in terms of the prerequisite programs. And Chapter 8 is about operations. So here we are going to look at the operational planning and control. So not only about the designing of the process, the operational process, but also how we're going to document these processes, what are the criteria that we have for them, and how they are controlled or monitored. In this chapter, something very important, and this is also different from other systems, design and development for FAMI-QS cannot be excluded from the management system, because we are talking about a safety system. And in the safety system, and because it includes a GMP and the AJCCP, any changes that are made in raw material, equipment, processes, any type of formulation, it does impact the system. So these changes are also considered by FAMI-QS as design and development. And you are going to see in 8.3, a whole guidance on how to draw your design and development process. And it's very straightforward. Do not overcomplicate that. Okay? All right. Important for in the chapter of operation. And in other systems, we have that also. We have to look if we have external provision of services and processes. If you hire or if you contract a manufacturer to deliver part of the process or an intermediary product, or then if you were working with an external warehouse, these are external services that are also part of your flow chart, that are also part of your system. So they should be considered in the system as contract manufacturers. So you should then review the way they operate, if they are certified or not certified, because that is going to give you more or less guarantees. If they are certified and FAMI-QS will accept according to a document that's also in the website, and it's part of the mandatory documents for certification. They recognize its standards. So not only a manufacturer that is certified by FAMI-QS, but there are other standards also that FAMI-QS has mutual recognitions with that can also be applied. But if your contract manufacturer is not certified, then you have to take a further action. You may have to perform a full audit, and then you will have to inform also your CB that you do have a contract manufacturer, that you chose to perform an audit, and your CB may then request for the audit report, and the CB may also request to visit this supplier if he still needs to more information that he cannot find in your report. So this is contract manufacturers. And in the next slide, we are going to see the purchase of materials. So here we are talking about the purchasing of raw materials, packaging materials, and other inputs that we use in our processes. We do not have anymore the famous decision tree. So they were excluded from the system, and they were turned into requirements. So there's still the classification of assured and non-assured sources. So you are able to purchase materials from assured and non-assured sources. So assured sources are those sources that are certified by FAMI-QS or any other recognized standard that is listed in this document that's showed here, the PMS 003, recognized standards available in the website. And a non-assured source would be a supplier that is not FAMI-QS certified or is also not certified by any other recognized scheme. So for these non-assured sources, you would have them to have a different approach in your system in order to guarantee that you are receiving quality and safe raw materials, and that you are not going to end up with an unsafe product or a product that's not according to your quality specification. If we go further on operation, then we have the AJCCP program. As we said before, the AJCCP will follow the methodology that is stated in the process documents, those 6 documents that are mandatory and that the auditor can require or can compare your system with. These documents and the AJCCP methodology follows the Codex Alimentarius methodology. So, the definitions and the way the AJCCP is developed is the methodology that is developed by Codex Alimentarius. Okay, still in operation, then, moving towards the end of chapter 8, we have the control of production with several different sub-items with requirements. Of course, identification and traceability as part of any quality and safety system. The preservation of the product, the way, to have the conservation of the product, the shelf life, and how, the validity dates and all these issues. Here, post-delivery activities, you may have as a requirement from an interested party, for example, your client, that you should provide also technical assistance, or then and it's being more common in different regions that you also take care of the packaging because of environmental issues and so on. So these are, some examples of post-delivery activities. Release. We must have in our system how we are going to release our final products and based on what criteria. And if we do have criteria and we controlled, we monitored the products, of course, we may have non-conforming products. And this is going to be approached in the control and non-conforming process outputs and products in chapter 8. And another requirement about rework. It's a part, it's a step of our flow chart. Maybe we go back to a previous step because the product does not conform to specifications, or then, it's a defective product, or then we have remainings, and then we do not want any loss, and we want to reintroduce that in the process. So the requirement for the rework is there, so that we make sure that we are not reintroducing any hazard, or we to make sure that we did take care of any rework that possibly exists. And then we go to the 2 final requirements. They are very short. One is the performance evaluation. And here, the chapter 9 basically brings 3 different tools for the evaluation of the performance of the whole system. So it's the whole of safety and quality system. And they are monitoring. So how we verify the system and how we check that we achieved the results that were stated and the objectives that were planned for the system. Another tool is the internal audit. A documented procedure will be required for that. And a program for internal audit should be in place as well. And the third tool will be the management review. If we look, we have some small differences in terms of the inputs for the management review. Some were added, but the process is mainly the same. And that gives us also opportunities for continual improvement in the operation of the system, maybe in the revision of the context that we visited in the first part of the scheme, because we are now facing different issues as we are now in this very difficult moment. So how does COVID impact your system? You should expect that auditors now will take it into account when they look at your context. So this is, also part of the management review and may trigger, opportunities for improvement or add new elements to the system. And the last chapter is chapter 10, where we have the improvement, and mainly two topics: non-conformities and the continuous improvement with the entries or the outputs that we had from the three previous elements that we saw in the performance evaluation. And here we can check the suitability of the system, if it's still working as planned, the adequacy of that, and the effectiveness of our system. And something new, the other systems, they usually take these two pillars, fraud and defense, as separate programs. FAMI-QS wanted to make only one big system. So fraud and defense are the two new pillars of our system. And they are part of the system because they have direct impact in several of the requirements that we saw, and vice versa. The requirements will also impact in the vulnerabilities we have for fraud, and also the prevention or the defenses we have in our system. And the idea to include that is because of all these different motivations and drivers that you see in this scheme, as the complexity of chains that we have nowadays, outsourcing that is now, globally spreaded, different regulatory backgrounds in different jurisdictions, fair play. So, all of them launched a program and included, showed the need to include in the scheme a feed, fraud, prevention, and defense requirements. So this is the newest inclusion in the system. So there are requirements, and these requirements are mandatory. There is a new module for fraud and defense. In this new module, and the text brings guidance also on how to work with the information, explanations and methods that will for sure give support to all the companies to implement the requirements. And also, FAMI-QS developed together with PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, templates for feed, fraud, and defense. And these templates, the operators will have to use. They will guide us through the process, will help us to develop and, to access the vulnerability and the defense that we must have in the system. And they will also give support to the auditing process, because once you have the opportunity to be in contact with this template, you are going to see that it is very you have to put all the justifications, and you have a lot of questions there that drives and directs you to in the assessments to the right answer, and that will help you to build your system. And if we go to the next slide, this is the FAMI-QS feed fraud and defense program. It is written in the same structure, following the high level structure of ISO. So if you take a look, the main entries are exactly the same, as to have an uniformity and an standardization of the document. So these are the main features that we have. Now I invite Kris to show you the top non-conformities that we have had in this audit, in the audits that were already completed. Kris has been in the field and talking with the companies, and I believe he has a lot of information to give to us, also some tips on how to implement, not to implement, but on the difficulties the company have had trying to implement the system. So Kris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Angela. I appreciate it. Some fantastic information there on clarifying items that have come up or that is new within the standard, because it is quite a drastic change from the previous version to the new one. So what we're going to move on to and talk about very quickly are, I usually like to bucket non-conformances when we talk about them into groups of 5, but instead of having the top 5, we're going to have about the top 6 non-conformances here. Clauses are down on the bottom there if you want to look at it and see where it's at. We're going to go through them in a bit detail in a couple seconds, but you can see about a third of the audits that are conducted are running into issues with the approved supplier program and such that's in place. You're also going to see as we go through, we have some challenges with HACCP programs, internal auditing, pest control, calibration and such, but we'll run into those, we'll describe those a little bit more further in some of the subsequent slides. If we go to the next slide, we'll end up seeing that we have a nice little list here that actually details the actual section, the clause that is present, as well as the clause number and the number of findings. One key point to kind of look at here compared to the graph that was on the previous one, this is the actual raw data, the numbers. The data on the previous slide was for percentages, and this was based on about 160 total audits that have already been conducted to version 6. If we move through, why don't we kind of talk about these top 6 that we were discussing? This is probably one of the most unique requirements that you'll run into in FAMI-QS compared to almost any other standard that is out within the industry. And this is really talking about the management of suppliers and really talking about our assured versus non-assured sources. Angela already brought up the document PMS 003, sorry, and it does describe the requirements in there. I really strongly recommend you do go in there and look at that, understand it, understand that you are going to have some recognition of equivalency that's in place, self-declarations, if they don't have particular recognized schemes in place and whatnot. Really ensure that you have this documentation present. Evaluate all those suppliers in detail. And one key item that I'd like to point out that I run into, not just with FAMI-QS audits, but almost any audit that I do, is if we are buying from a very large corporation, a lot of sites have company information, but not site-specific information. We need to ensure that that approved supplier documentation is site-specific. And like any system, do what you say and say what you do sort of deal, right? We want to make sure our documented program lines up with the practices that are in place. Next slide, we're going to kind of move to and talk about another item that says document what you say and do what you say you'll do, is your HACCP program. Some of the challenges I see here is we don't get granular enough into the details when we're talking about hazards. A good example would be you look at a hazard like mycotoxins. It's really important that we get a bit more detailed into those requirements as it pertains to something like aflatoxin. We do know that there's some risks and some animals that have more of a susceptibility and a challenge with certain types of hazards that are present versus others. So we want to make sure we get down to the specifics as far as possible, because those will help define the control measures that are in place that will be required, that may be elevated to a critical control point within our HACCP program. Also want to make sure you're looking at that flow chart. Need to make sure that it is verified. Remember, this is a preliminary step within a development of a HACCP program. We need to make sure that we are verifying it. And really, we need to be verifying it across all shifts and all operations. We need to ensure that that is how everything is following at all times for all products that are covered and for all processes. So it's very important that's done. It's not just sitting in a conference room reviewing it at a conference table and being done. No, we need to be on the floor and verifying that. We do find gaps in that regularly in place. We did talk about site-specific for supplier approval there for a bit. We need to make sure that our validation that is in place for critical control points is site-specific. Sometimes we can share information across a corporate group, but there needs to be validation for the plan and the program for the site, because these are site-specific programs. It's very important we do have that. We need to also make sure that people are clearly aware of the roles and responsibilities in the programs and how things need to be done. We end up finding sometimes challenges that it will be documented, or document the names of the documents are not clearly written down as to what needs to be filled out or who needs to do those activities. Very important that you get as detailed as possible, so we always have continued application and adherence to the program as written. So after number 2, we'll run to number 3. Talk about pest control. Now, this one is obviously challenging one sometimes within the feed industry, depending on the fabric of a facility. Sometimes we have had to update buildings. They are a bit older sometimes, just based on the processes that are present. But we do need to make sure that we are looking at all potential ingress locations and all harborage locations that are at a facility and eliminating them. A good example is like dock levelers, roof overhangs. Is there bird roosting that could be present? We need to make sure we evaluate it. Taking a step back after that, or even before that, before looking at seizing up those openings and continuously being done, is looking at your pest control program being risk-based. A lot of times we have situations where pest control programs are off the shelf that are simply, we're going to do it once a week and once a month, and that's it. We don't look at the actual risk for the site. Maybe you need to have more frequent exterior servicing of bait stations because you have a field behind you that's a harvest location, and it really spikes in harvest time, because all rodents are running out there. Maybe you have a challenge with certain times of year with bugs, and we need to have an elevated program on that end. We need to really pay attention to that and ensure that the program is designed to facilitate appropriate control. Also, always look at your pesticides being appropriately handled and that you have those records on file. Challenges that I've run into sometimes with sites is we forget to communicate that information to maintenance personnel, sanitation personnel, etc., and you find the occasional can of household pesticide in place. So something that really needs to kind of be looked at on that side. And then finally, a very simple, straightforward one is we do need to look at having our schematics that are showing the location of all traps that are used being up to date and current. So this should list temporary traps that are required as well. They should be accurate to the location and the number of traps that are present. So some of this stuff is fairly straightforward, but it can take some time to develop. When we move on to the next one here, looking at measuring devices. This is really a key one here, is talking about calibration. So really we want to look at the devices that we use within the facility that are going to be measuring particular requirements of either a process or a product. Are they being calibrated and are they accurate? If they are being used, are they being protected from potential damage? Do we have situations if we do use thermometers, or if we're using pH meters, things like that, are they stored in a location where they won't drop on the floor and get damaged or broken? We need to make sure that we're protecting against those. Are we ensuring that the frequency of calibration is suitable for the process that's in place? We talked about pest control being risk-based. We should be looking at calibration in a way that way as well. But you also want to make sure that you're taking into account regulatory requirements on that front. Do you need to use external companies? And if you are you ensuring that that company is accredited to 17025 or an equivalent on that end? And then another thing that the FAMI-QS standard pulls in that they specify, which some other standards don't, is talking about the use of computer software. We need to make sure that A, it is verified that it's going to give us the accurate results that we need, and we need to ensure that it is validated if it is for a CCP, which is used at times. So that is very important information on that end. And then we've got 8.8, this is identification and traceability. This is going to be accounting for our products, our one up, one back, traceability challenge. So ensuring we know what products we used and where we have shipped it to. Are we challenging ourselves on a regular basis? One situation that I find every once in a while is facilities that do their traceability challenges that are required. They do it on the easiest product to recall. Or to trace, I should say, not recall. They look at what is easy to trace. It's only a 2-component item. There's not very many micro ingredients in place. We want to make sure we make our challenges as difficult as possible. We want to find the problems in our challenges. We don't want to find them out when we actually have a situation or when we are being audited. We want to ensure that they are appropriate and functional at all times. You want to make sure that your batch identification system is clearly defined and being followed throughout, and that all your materials at all times are identified. This seems to be a challenge for things like work in progress or rework, which is something that Angela was talking about earlier as well. Last thing that we run into every once in a while is customer information not being accurate, or necessary bodies that need to be contacted in the event of a recall. We need to make sure that we are verifying that in the event we do need to notify customers of a situation where we need to have a recall. So this is kind of linked to both traceability and recall on that side. Internal audits, this is probably your biggest control that you want to look at. Gaps in here typically seem to be challenges where we aren't really doing full system audits. There's a lot of assumptions that are being made and we're not really pushing ourselves. So one key challenge that I'm running into when I'm running into the V6 facility is many have not audited themselves against the FAMI-QS version 6 requirements. This is paramount. You need to have self-control here. It is very important that you have detailed internal audits that are identifying your conformance and your non-conformance at points. Challenge yourself. Conduct a traceability challenge during these internal audits. Interview your employees. Get detailed information as it's going through. Gather that evidence and write that information down in the actual internal audit reports. You need to demonstrate compliance. This is your self-control on that end. That being said, if you have challenges where we aren't able to do that once in a while, we need to maybe get training to get that done for the standards. So really take a look at that. Ensure that you are using trained and competent personnel to do it, and you're providing enough information to demonstrate that you're in compliance, and that you are following up on any non-conformances and verifying those if they are identified within these internal audit programs. So to kind of, with a takeaway here, some points of action: really become clear and understand the version 6 requirements. Ensure that you are looking at things like a high-level structure, which is what Angela was talking about. If you can't get the FAMI training specifically for you, it is challenging at times, but you can look at something like a high-level structure training for ISO 9001, ISO 22000, 2018. That can help for sure. As we just covered within internal audits, ensure your system has been fully reviewed to meet all the new requirements. If that is something you can't do, always look at potentially having a pre-assessment with a knowledgeable auditor that will help you identify those gaps potentially. They won't recommend technically how to solve that, but you'll at least know where those gaps are at that front. Ensure that you're following up with your new scope approval letter. Since we do have these new processes that are in place, we want to make sure that we're lining up and we identify everything properly on that end. And then finally, make sure that all your documentation and especially the internal audit program is beneficial and meets what you're doing. Avoid your pencil whipping. Continually challenge yourself. Spread your audits out throughout the year so you're not rushed to jam everything into 1 or 2 days. So take a look at that, and I think you'll find a lot of success moving into the version 6 standard. That being said, that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much.
We are now going to open the floor to questions from our participants. Please type your questions into the chat box on your right.